1, 2,
And review, somebody female.
Oh shit, I got some blood going. Oh, he's wearing it too.
You're in the bay. Once you get over to the bed, we'll give you the story. Everything's going to happen super fast. Welcome to the emergency room.
I lost the phone.
It's, charter book.
300 please.
I'll keep your card again.
Pulse check. No pulse.
No more pulse.
Yeah. Here, what do the echo people get? And her blood pressure is off the property.
45 minutes of CPR and no return of circulation. Okay.
Oh.
Imagine a fractured femur. Like, you've been in this terrible skiing accident, right? We're in the emergency room, and the doctor snaps an x-ray up on the light board.
Right.
And there it is. Just a jagged, unmistakable white line cutting right across the dark gray bone. The physician points to it and says, "There's the break."
Yeah, it's right there in front of you.
Exactly. And immediately, there's a protocol, a cast. Maybe you need surgery, maybe, 6 weeks of physical therapy. It's precise. It's totally visible. You can literally just point to the problem.
It's an incredibly comforting paradigm, honestly. I mean, we are fundamentally wired to like things that are binary.
Right.
Broken or whole,
Okay.
infected or clear. Categorization just makes us feel like we have some sort of control over the chaos of human biology.
But then, and this is where it gets interesting, you step away from the orthopedic ward and you walk through the double doors of a psychiatric unit.
Yeah, that's a whole different world.
It really is. Suddenly that metaphorical x-ray machine is just completely useless. You cannot take a picture of a fractured coping mechanism. You can't draw blood to measure a deficit in self-esteem or a sudden loss of reality orientation. You're stepping into this diagnostic landscape that is entirely invisible to traditional imaging.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You are relying on observation, on patient history, on highly subjective reporting, and on the incredibly nuanced interaction between the patient and their environment.
Which brings us exactly to the mission for you, our listener, today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
We are unpacking the core foundational concepts of psychiatric and mental health nursing practice, and we are doing this with a very specific high-yield approach.
Yeah, whether you're a nursing student who is standing outside a clinical rotation right now, furiously trying to figure out how to talk to a patient in crisis without making things worse.
We've all been there.
Oh, absolutely. Or maybe you're just an intensely curious person who sees the mental health crisis in your city and wants to understand how the system actually works or, fails to work. This conversation is built for you.
Exactly. We're going after that 80-20 breakdown. We want to extract the 20% of historical context, systemic structure, and clinical logic that will give you 80% of the understanding of the entire psychiatric landscape.
It's the high-yield stuff.
The highest yield. We're going to explore how humanity went from believing in demonic possession to building these massive asylums, how a single scientific breakthrough in the 1950s actually accidentally broke the modern mental health system.
Yeah, that's a wild story.
It really is. And most importantly, we're going to talk about the vital, highly dangerous, and deeply misunderstood role of the psychiatric nurse on the front lines today.
Because it's a journey that goes so far beyond just medicine. To really understand mental health care, you have to understand the law, the economy, civil rights, and frankly, human sociology.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to figure out where the system is failing today, we first have to establish a baseline, right? We have to figure out how the medical community even defines the concept of being healthy. And when you look at the World Health Organization's standard, it's not what you might think. They don't just say health is the absence of a cold or a tumor.
No, they set a bar that is radically comprehensive. I mean, the WHO defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity.
Wait, I have to push back on that immediately.
Go for it.
Complete well-being. That feels completely utopian to me. Like, if I am stressed out because my car broke down and I have no idea how I'm going to pay for it, I am definitely not in a state of complete social well-being. Does the WHO really categorize me as unhealthy in that moment? It just seems like an impossibly broad metric.
It is highly aspirational, yeah. And your reaction is very common. But the philosophy behind it is actually vital to understand.
Yeah.
Historically, medicine defined health by what was missing, right?
Yeah.
No fever, no tumor, no fracture, therefore, boom, you were healthy.
Right.
But the WHO is trying to reframe health as a positive, active state. If you possess a robust state of emotional, physical, and social well-being, you have the capacity to fulfill your life responsibilities. You can function effectively within your community.
So it's about what you can do, not just what you don't have.
Exactly. You can actually experience satisfaction in your interpersonal relationships and within yourselves.
Yeah.
It's not just about surviving day to day, it's about the capacity to actually thrive.
Okay, I get that.
Right.
But when it comes to mental health specifically, there isn't a single universal definition like there is for, say, a normal blood pressure range. Like blood pressure is just a number, but mental health is fluid.
Precisely. And this is the first major concept to master here. We often have to look at a person's outward behavior to gather clues about their internal mental health.
Yeah.
But behavior is not objective. How we interpret a specific behavior depends entirely on our own values, our own beliefs, and the specific culture we operate within.
Yeah, what is considered a totally adaptive, normal behavior in one culture might be seen as highly inappropriate or even pathological in another.
Absolutely.
To make sense of this, the foundational framework breaks the factors influencing mental health into three distinct buckets: individual, interpersonal, and social determinants. Let's really pull these apart.
Let's do it.
Starting with individual factors, what exactly falls into this category?
So these are the intrinsic personal elements. Obviously, your biological makeup and genetics are in here, but it goes much deeper into your internal psychological landscape. We are looking at a person's sense of autonomy and independence. We're looking at their baseline self-esteem.
Vitality is included here too, which I find really fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
The literal energy and drive to just engage with life.
Yes, vitality and the capacity for personal growth, the ability to find a sense of meaning in life. But perhaps the most critical individual factor is resilience.
Emotional hardiness.
Exactly. Because resilience isn't the absence of trauma or stress. Everyone experiences stress. It's the internal mechanism that allows a person to absorb a massive shock to their system and eventually return to a baseline state of functioning.
Right.
It's reality orientation, how accurately a person perceives the world around them, and how effectively they manage stress.
Okay, so that's the internal world, the first bucket. And then we have the second bucket, interpersonal factors. This is the connective tissue between people.
This is how you relate to the world outside your own mind. It encompasses your ability to communicate effectively with others, your capacity to help others, and your ability to experience genuine intimacy.
It's a balancing act, really.
It is. A healthy interpersonal state means finding that delicate equilibrium between being separate, having your own distinct identity and boundaries, and being deeply connected to other human beings.
Yeah. And then we reach the third bucket.
Yeah.
And honestly, when you look at the discourse around mental health today, this feels like the area that is chronically ignored in favor of just talking about brain chemistry. Social determinants.
Oh, the social determinants of health cannot be overstated. Their impact is absolutely massive. We're talking about non-medical, environmental, and societal factors that dictate your lived reality.
We're talking about a basic sense of community, access to adequate resources, education, employment, job security, income, food security.
And crucially, it involves the society's tolerance or intolerance of violence. It involves the level of support for diversity, social inclusion, and the presence or absence of systemic discrimination.
It completely reframes the conversation, doesn't it? Like, if you do not have food security, if you are constantly terrified of violence in your neighborhood, your mental health is going to plummet.
Without a doubt.
But that's not necessarily a neurotransmitter deficit. That's a societal deficit causing psychological distress.
Exactly. And if we flip the coin to look at mental illness,
Yeah.
we see the exact same three categories at play, just inverted. Mental illness is broadly defined by disorders that affect mood, behavior, and thinking. Conditions like depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, addictive disorders, these conditions cause significant distress or impaired functioning. People dealing with these illnesses often experience a deep dissatisfaction with themselves and their relationships.
Their coping mechanisms become ineffective. The basic tasks of daily life suddenly feel like moving mountains.
Yeah, and the contributing factors align perfectly with those three buckets. Individually, you might have a biological predisposition to a disease, or you might be experiencing intolerable, overwhelming worries. You might have an inability to distinguish reality from fantasy, which we see in psychotic disorders, or just a profound, paralyzing loss of meaning in your life.
And interpersonally, the factors might look like highly ineffective communication, excessive dependency on another person, total withdrawal from relationships, or feeling like you completely lack a sense of belonging anywhere.
But again, the social determinants of mental illness are what we really must highlight for a complete understanding. A lack of basic resources, exposure to violence, homelessness, crushing poverty, and systemic discrimination like stigma, racism, classism, ageism, sexism.
It's heavy.
It is. These societal failures exert an immense crushing pressure on the human psyche.
And this leads to what I think is the most vital, high-yield distinction in this entire foundational breakdown. I want to make sure we make this perfectly clear.
Let's hear it.
The consensus is that severe social and cultural factors like being chronically unhoused or facing relentless systemic racism can absolutely cause profound isolation, alienation, and even maladaptive, self-destructive, or violent behavior.
Yes.
But that distress does not automatically mean the person has a psychiatric illness.
That is a phenomenal point of distinction. The highest yield thing to remember here is that experiencing severe, even paralyzing distress because you are sleeping on the street or facing systemic oppression is a completely normal human reaction to an abnormal and deeply harmful situation.
Right.
The distress is real. The impairment in daily functioning is totally real. But it does not automatically equate to a biological or psychological pathology that warrants a psychiatric diagnosis.
We can't use medicine to cover up a societal failure.
Exactly. We must be incredibly careful not to pathologize a normal reaction to an impossible situation. If someone is terrified because their environment is literally dangerous, prescribing them an anti-anxiety medication without addressing the housing crisis is fundamentally misunderstanding the source of the distress.
Which brings us perfectly to the rulebook. If the lines are this blurry, how does the medical community actually agree on who has a disorder and who is just reacting to a terrible situation?
The manual.
That's where the DSM-5TR comes in. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, with its text revision published in 2022, this is the ultimate taxonomy used in the United States.
Published by the American Psychiatric Association. It is the definitive guide that describes all recognized mental disorders, outlining highly specific diagnostic criteria based on decades of clinical experience and empirical research.
Right. Though, for the sake of a global perspective, it's important to note that the World Health Organization's ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases, is the taxonomy utilized by much of the rest of the world.
Yep. The DSM has three main stated purposes. First, it provides a standardized nomenclature and language for all mental health professionals. Second, it presents defining characteristics or symptoms to differentiate specific diagnoses from one another. And third, it assists in identifying underlying causes.
By standardizing the language, it allows a practitioner in New York and a practitioner in California to know they are talking about the exact same clinical presentation.
Exactly. It helps identify the primary psychiatric disorder, any relevant medical conditions that might be exacerbating the psychological state, and it formally recognizes those psychosocial and environmental problems, the social determinants we just discussed, that are heavily influencing the patient's presentation.
I keep visualizing the DSM as a dictionary, like a massive, incredibly dense dictionary for a completely invisible landscape. But here is where I struggle, and I want you to play out this hypothetical.
Okay, I'm ready.
If culture dictates what is considered adaptive versus inappropriate, and this manual is written by human beings who exist within a very specific culture at a very specific moment in time, if society changes its values entirely over 50 years, does the Dictionary of Mental Illness just instantly become obsolete?
That is the defining tension of psychiatric diagnosis, and the answer is absolutely yes.
Really?
Yes, the manual has to change, and historically we have watched it happen. There are behaviors and identities that were explicitly classified as severe mental illnesses in early iterations of the DSM that are entirely absent from the modern text.
Because the culture shifted.
Because cultural norms evolved, the scientific understanding of human diversity expanded, and the psychiatric community realized they were pathologizing human variation rather than actual illness.
So it's a living document. It's an attempt to categorize the infinite complexity of human suffering, but it is inextricably tied to the lens of the society holding the pen.
Precisely. Which is why it goes through revisions, like the 2022 text revision. It is an ongoing, imperfect process of refining our understanding.
What's really fascinating, particularly for the nursing students listening, is the specific instruction on how they're actually supposed to interact with this massive book.
Yes, this is a crucial clinical boundary and a very testable concept. Student nurses and registered nurses at the basic level of practice do not use the DSM to formally diagnose clients.
Right.
The act of formal diagnosis is legally and clinically the purview of the psychiatrist, the psychiatric nurse practitioner, or another advanced practice clinician.
So if they aren't diagnosing, why are they spending hours memorizing the criteria? Like, why is it tested so heavily?
Context and anticipation. A nurse uses the DSM to profoundly understand the reason for a patient's admission. It provides the architectural framework for their care. If a patient is admitted with a diagnosis of severe depression or acute schizophrenia, the nurse references the DSM criteria to understand exactly what internal experiences and external behaviors that patient is likely to manifest.
It's like reading the weather report before walking outside.
That's a great way to put it. If the criteria mention auditory hallucinations or intense psychomotor agitation, the nurse can anticipate safety needs, adjust the environment, and tailor their therapeutic communication before the patient even exhibits the behavior. It's about building a comprehensive nursing care plan based on informed context, not just slapping a label on a chart.
Okay, so we have this modern, highly detailed manual. We understand the complex interplay of biology and sociology, but humanity has been wrestling with mental illness for thousands of years. How did we explain and treat these invisible fractures before the scientific method, before anyone ever dreamed of a DSM?
Oh man, the history of mental health treatment is a deeply dark, fascinating, and often tragic reflection of human fear.
Going all the way back to ancient times, the operating theory was incredibly simple and incredibly dangerous. Any sickness, physical or mental, was viewed as an indication of the displeasure of the gods. It was divine punishment for sins committed.
And the treatment you received depended entirely on how your specific symptoms were culturally interpreted. If you developed a mental disorder and your behavior happened to align with what the culture considered divine or prophetic, you might be worshipped or elevated as a spiritual conduit.
But if your behavior was chaotic, aggressive, or culturally transgressive?
Then you were viewed as demonic. You were possessed.
Yeah.
And the response was to cast you out. People were ostracized, severely punished, and in extreme cases, burned at the stake to eradicate the perceived evil.
Then you get to Aristotle around 382 to 322 BC, and he actually makes a fascinating conceptual leap. He tries to strip away the demonic element and relate mental disorders directly to physical, biological imbalances. He develops a theory of the four humors: blood, water, yellow bile, and black bile.
It was an attempt at early pathophysiology. Aristotle theorized that these four physical substances directly controlled human emotions. The humors dictated happiness, calmness, anger, and sadness. Therefore, if a person exhibited extreme, uncontrollable sadness or mania, it wasn't a demon. It was a physical imbalance of these internal fluids.
Which sounds vaguely scientific until you look at the actual treatments. Because if you have too much black bile causing depression, how do they fix it?
Bloodletting?
Bloodletting, starving the patient, violent purging. They were trying to physically drain the emotion out of the body to restore the balance. And the truly astounding part is that this medical paradigm, these brutal physical treatments, persisted well into the 19th century.
It is staggering to think about the longevity of that theory. And yet, there were periods where society regressed even further. During early Christian times, roughly from 1 to 1000 AD, any early attempts at biological explanation were largely abandoned. Society reverted heavily to primitive beliefs and profound superstitions.
Everything was demons again.
All diseases, but especially mental illness, were once again blamed entirely on demons.
The possessed individual was subjected to exorcisms by priests. And when the chanting and the prayers inevitably failed to cure a biological disease like schizophrenia, the interventions became unimaginably cruel. Incarceration in dark dungeons, brutal flogging, systematic starvation. The illness was treated as a crime against God.
As we move forward into the Renaissance period in England, roughly the 1300s to 1600s, we see a slight bureaucratic shift. They began to legally distinguish people with mental illness from common criminals.
Which is a step, I guess.
A small one. If an individual with a mental illness was deemed harmless, they were essentially abandoned, allowed to wander the countryside, relying on the unreliable charity of strangers.
But if they were deemed a dangerous lunatic, they were thrown into prisons alongside violent criminals, chained to stone walls, and starved. Which leads directly to the creation of one of the most infamous institutions in human history, the Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem.
Formerly declared a hospital for the insane in 1547.
Better known to history as Bedlam. It was the first institution of its kind, supposedly a place of care. But by 1775, it had devolved into something grotesque. It literally became a tourist attraction.
That is one of the most chilling details of the era.
Members of the public would actually pay a fee to enter the hospital, walk the halls, and view the inmates. They viewed them and ridiculed them as if they were animals in a menagerie. It was entertainment.
Unbelievable.
Meanwhile, across the ocean in the American colonies, they were still engaged in literal witch hunts, executing people whose bizarre behavior was interpreted as witchcraft rather than mental illness.
When you look closely at Bedlam and the witch trials, what you are seeing is the systemic manifestation of a profound societal fear. When human beings are confronted with unpredictable, uncontrollable behavior that they do not understand, empathy evaporates.
Right.
It is replaced by a primal need to control, hide, or destroy the source of the fear.
But history operates in pendulums. And in the 1790s, we enter the period of Enlightenment. This is where the modern conceptualization of psychiatric care begins to take shape.
We see the emergence of key historical figures who challenged the brutal status quo. Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England. They fundamentally rejected the use of chains, dungeons, and starvation. They formulated a revolutionary concept, the asylum.
I really want to pause on that word, asylum, because in our modern vocabulary, it evokes horror movies. It sounds terrifying. But we have to understand what that word meant to Pinel and Tuke.
The literal definition of asylum is a safe refuge, a haven offering protection. Their intention was incredibly noble. They looked at individuals suffering in prisons and said, these people are sick, not evil. They advocated for removing them from the dungeons and placing them in pastoral, peaceful environments. This was the birth of what they called the moral treatment of the mentally ill.
In the United States, the great champion of this movement was a woman named Dorothea Dix. In the mid-1800s, she visited Tuke's institution in England, saw the moral treatment in action, and returned to America on an absolute crusade.
She was a force of nature.
She fundamentally believed that a civilized society had a profound moral obligation to care for its most vulnerable members. She didn't just write letters, she aggressively lobbied state legislatures, demanding adequate shelter, nutritious food, and warm clothing for the mentally ill.
And her advocacy was incredibly effective. Dorothea Dix was directly instrumental in securing the funding and political will to open 32 massive state hospitals across the United States. The initial vision was pure humanitarian reform. These were designed to be grand sanctuaries.
But here's where it gets incredibly tragic. The asylum system was invented specifically to rescue people from the horrors of the prison system. But within a single century, the asylum system entirely collapsed under its own weight.
The period of enlightenment was tragically short-lived. Those 32 state hospitals, initially built with the best of intentions, ran into massive systemic trouble.
The rural locations, which Tuke and Dix thought would provide pastoral peace, backfired. They just ended up completely isolating patients from their families and their communities. It became out of sight, out of mind, and as the population grew, the funding did not keep pace.
They became severely overcrowded. Without adequate staffing or resources, the environment deteriorated rapidly. The text notes that attendants were frequently accused of abusing residents. The original humanitarian vision evaporated, and the phrase insane asylum completely lost its meaning as a safe refuge.
Yeah.
It took on the deeply negative, terrifying connotation we recognize today.
It is a devastating irony. Society built these magnificent structures to save people from prisons, and because we refused to properly fund them, they simply became a new kind of prison. Just warehouses for human beings.
But even during the darkest days of the overcrowded asylum era, a new scientific paradigm was quietly gaining momentum. We see the emergence of Sigmund Freud, who challenged the scientific community to view human behavior and neurosis objectively. He pioneered the intense study of the mind and its complex, hidden disorders.
We also see Emil Kraepelin, who took a massive step forward by actually classifying mental disorders according to their specific symptom clusters, creating an early precursor to the DSM. And Eugen Bleuler, the psychiatrist who coined the term schizophrenia, they were laying the foundational bricks of modern psychiatry.
Yet, despite these theoretical advancements, the physical reality remained exactly the same. The asylum era dominated. Hundreds of thousands of people lived locked away in massive, chaotic institutions. That was the status quo until the early 1950s.
And this brings us to a singular moment that completely rewrote the rules of reality for psychiatric care, the psychopharmacology revolution.
It is difficult to overstate how transformative this was. Around 1950, scientists developed chlorpromazine, widely known as Thorazine. This was an antipsychotic medication. Around the exact same time, lithium was introduced as an anti-anemic agent. These were the first true psychotropic drugs.
Over the next decade, the floodgates opened. We saw the introduction of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs. We saw haloperidol, tricyclic antidepressants, and anti-anxiety agents like benzodiazepines. The foundational text states that for the absolute first time in human history, chemical interventions actually reduced extreme agitation, cleared psychotic thinking, and lifted paralyzing depression.
I want you to truly imagine the sensory shift in a state hospital during this transition. Before 1950, a severe psychiatric ward was often characterized by immense noise, physical chaos, and behavioral unpredictability. But as these medications were introduced, the wards literally quieted down.
Wow.
The level of agitation plummeted. Patients who had been trapped in relentless hallucinations for years suddenly experienced clarity. And because they were stabilized, the unthinkable happened. Hospital stays dramatically shortened. People actually became well enough to leave the asylum and go home.
And that realization triggered a massive systemic earthquake in the United States, a movement that would define the next half-century: deinstitutionalization.
Deinstitutionalization was a deliberate, monumental shift in public policy. It was spurred heavily by the Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act of 1963. The legislative goal was to move away from locking people in massive, isolated state hospitals and instead provide care in community-based facilities.
The philosophy was sound. The idea was to treat people in the least restrictive environment possible. Instead of one massive hospital in the middle of nowhere, there would be smaller, localized centers serving specific geographic areas, keeping patients close to their homes, their families, and their friends.
These community centers were mandated to provide a comprehensive web of services: emergency psychiatric care, short-term inpatient care, robust outpatient services, partial hospitalization programs, as well as community screening and education.
And initially, deinstitutionalization accomplished exactly what it set out to do, and it did it very quickly. It released thousands of individuals who had been locked in long-term stays. It radically decreased new admissions to state hospitals, and it forced the development of alternative community-based services.
But while the medical and philosophical shift was happening, there were massive financial mechanisms shifting in the background. Specifically, the creation of supplemental security income, or SSI, and Social Security Disability Income, SSDI.
Now, this sounds like a good thing on paper, right? It gave people with severe and persistent mental illness independent financial resources. They didn't have to rely entirely on their families or the state hospital for basic survival money.
It was a crucial step for personal autonomy, but it created an enormous, unintended financial loophole for state governments.
Wait, how does federal disability money create a loophole for the states?
Because SSI and SSDI are federally funded programs.
Yeah.
Once state politicians realized that patients living in the community could receive federal money to survive, the states realized they could drastically cut their own state budgets.
Oh.
They could empty the state hospitals, transfer the financial burden to the federal government, and wash their hands of the immense cost of comprehensive psychiatric care.
Oh, wow. So the motivation to empty the asylums wasn't just about human rights and better medications. It was massively driven by state governments eager to save a fortune.
Exactly. And this economic motivation coincided with significant changes in commitment laws in the early 1970s.
Right, because the civil rights movement was in full swing, and advocates rightfully pointed out that you shouldn't be able to lock someone in an institution indefinitely just because they act strangely. They pushed to make it much, much more difficult to commit someone for mental health treatment against their will.
It was a vital advancement for human rights and civil liberties, but practically, it had a profound secondary effect. It further accelerated the emptying of the state hospitals and gave states even more justification to slash mental health budgets.
Okay, so I have to ask about the basic logistics of this transition. They have this grand utopian plan for thousands of community centers. They have new drugs, they have shifting funding structures. But did they actually build the community safety nets before they opened the doors and emptied out the hospitals?
That is the million-dollar question that defines the modern era of psychiatry. And the answer is tragically, catastrophically, no. The original federal legislation stated that 2,000 comprehensive community mental health centers were supposed to be fully operational by 1980 to handle the influx of patients.
And how many were actually built?
By 1990, a full decade past the deadline, only 1,300 programs existed, and many of those were severely underfunded.
So they completely dismantled the massive institutional safety net, and the replacement system simply never materialized for everyone who needed it.
If you look at the macro picture, deinstitutionalization was a perfect storm of unintended consequences. You had a genuine and miraculous medical breakthrough with psychotropics. You had a righteous, necessary desire for civil rights and less restrictive care. But you combine that with state governments incredibly eager to save money and a failure to build the promised infrastructure.
And the result?
The ultimate result was the systemic abandonment of the most vulnerable people in society.
The foundational text is incredibly blunt about this. It explicitly states that people with severe and persistent mental illness were largely ignored or vastly underserved by the community centers that did open. If you had a mild case of anxiety or depression, sure, you could get outpatient therapy. But if you were dealing with severe chronic schizophrenia, the community center simply did not have the resources to manage your care. You were left behind.
The consequences of this failure to provide adequate treatment are devastatingly clear. The text lists the direct outcomes of untreated severe mental illness: entirely preventable disability, a drastically poorer quality of life, the total deterioration of family relationships, severe physical health comorbidities, chronic homelessness, frequent arrest and incarceration, high rates of victimization, suicidality, familial violence, and in some cases, danger to the public.
So if the enormous hospitals closed down and the promised community centers were never fully built, where did all those patients go? Where are they right now? This leads us directly to the crisis of the 21st century, the systemic fallout.
The statistics defining our current reality are staggering.
Looking at data from the National Institutes of Mental Health, in 2021, an estimated 57.8 million adults in the United States had a diagnosable mental illness. But of those 57.8 million people, only 26.5 million received any form of treatment. That means over half of the people suffering received absolutely zero care.
And we are seeing similar trends in youth. Nearly 11 million children and adolescents are diagnosed with severe disorders like anxiety, ADHD, and clinical depression.
But here's a statistic that provides incredible perspective on the scale of the issue. The economic burden of mental illness in the U.S., which calculates direct healthcare costs combined with the massive loss of productivity, actually exceeds the economic burden caused by all types of cancer combined.
It is the absolute leading cause of disability for individuals aged 15 to 44 in both the United States and Canada. The need is overwhelming, yet only 1 in 4 adults and 1 in 5 children who require acute services actually receive them.
Which brings us to the most damning structural consequence of deinstitutionalization. The text refers to it as the revolving door effect.
This phenomenon is the core dysfunction of our modern psychiatric infrastructure. When deinstitutionalization occurred, the number of available public psychiatric hospital beds was reduced by roughly 80%. But simultaneously, the number of admissions to those few remaining beds increased by 90%.
Wait, I need you to explain the math on that. How do you have 80% fewer beds, but almost double the amount of admissions? That seems impossible.
It happens because the nature of the hospital stay fundamentally changed. We moved from long-term institutionalization to incredibly short, acute, unplanned hospital stays.
So let's walk through a hypothetical scenario to understand this revolving door. A person with severe and persistent mental illness decompensates in the community. They are in a full-blown crisis, perhaps experiencing severe psychosis. They are brought to the hospital and admitted. What happens next?
So they're placed in an acute inpatient bed. Over the next few days, the clinical team works aggressively to manage the immediate crisis. They restart the patient's psychotropic medications. They ensure the patient receives nutrition and sleep in a secure, controlled environment. Within a few days, the most extreme acute symptoms, the violent agitation, the florid hallucinations, begin to subside. The patient shows clinical signs of improvement.
But they aren't actually healed. They're just past the peak of the immediate emergency.
Correct. They are chemically subdued and temporarily stabilized, but the underlying chronic condition has not been deeply addressed. Yet because beds are so incredibly scarce and insurance companies mandate strict timelines, the hospital must discharge them.
So they are discharged in, what, 3 to 5 days?
Exactly, 3 to 5 days. They are discharged right back into the exact same community environment that triggered the crisis, often without the necessary outpatient appointments, without stable housing, and without the deeply ingrained coping skills required to maintain their medication regimen independently.
And because they lack that support, they inevitably stop taking their medication, they decompensate again, the psychosis returns, and a few weeks later, they are right back in the emergency room, over and over again, the revolving door.
And this continuous, relentless flow of acute crisis admissions completely overwhelms the psychiatric units in general hospitals. There simply aren't enough beds for the volume of patients caught in this cycle.
Which leads directly to a phenomenon called emergency department boarding. The text notes that ED visits for individuals in acute psychiatric distress have skyrocketed, increasing by 400% to 500% in certain metropolitan areas.
ED boarding is a critical failure point in this system. When a psychiatric patient arrives at an emergency department in crisis, but there are absolutely no inpatient psychiatric beds available in the hospital or anywhere in the region, that patient is boarded.
Meaning they are literally kept in the emergency department, just waiting.
Yes. They are held in the ED environment, which is typically bright, incredibly loud, chaotic, and completely devoid of specialized psychiatric programming, while the staff frantically calls other facilities trying to find a bed. Or they simply wait for days to see if the patient's crisis resolves on its own.
That sounds like a psychological nightmare. You take someone experiencing paranoid delusions or acute sensory overload, and you trap them in the most highly stimulating, stressful environment imaginable for 72 hours.
It is traumatic for the patient. It leads to immense frustration and burnout for the healthcare personnel who are not equipped to provide long-term psychiatric care in an ER bay. And some experts argue this agonizing delay in proper treatment contributes to an increase in suicide risk.
Let's also break down why those 3 to 5 day inpatient stays are so fundamentally flawed when you factor in a massive reality of modern psychiatry: comorbidity. The text notes that a huge percentage of people caught in the revolving door have dual diagnoses. They are dealing with a severe mental illness plus a chronic substance misuse disorder.
This complicates the clinical picture exponentially. The use of alcohol and illicit drugs severely exacerbates the symptoms of underlying mental illness and often directly interacts with or nullifies psychotropic medications.
So if you admit a patient who is actively detoxing while simultaneously experiencing a schizophrenic break, and you only have them for 3 days,
there is absolutely no way to effectively or safely treat that patient. You might barely manage the physical symptoms of the withdrawal in 3 days. But true substance misuse treatment requires profound psychological intervention, behavioral modification, and long-term comprehensive support. A 3-day hold cannot touch a dual diagnosis.
So when I look at the revolving door, the ED boarding, the 3-day stays, what does this all mean? To me, it sounds like modern psychiatry is forced to apply a tiny temporary Band-Aid to a massive gaping wound every 3 days, rather than actually taking the patient into surgery to fix the problem.
That is a very apt, if grim, analogy. The system is designed to stabilize the immediate life-threatening crisis, but it is structurally and financially incapable of treating the underlying chronic condition.
And when patients aren't in those brief 3-day hospital stays and they don't have community support, where do they end up? They end up on the streets. Homelessness is inextricably linked to this crisis. We have over 500,000 people experiencing homelessness in the United States on any given night.
And the demographics within that population are stark. Approximately 1/3 of all people experiencing homelessness are actively suffering from a severe mental illness or a chronic substance use disorder.
And if you look at the chronically homeless, the roughly 22% of the population who have been unhoused for long, extended periods, the numbers jump even higher. 30% of the chronically homeless have a severe psychiatric illness, and 2/3 suffer from a substance use disorder or a chronic physical health condition.
Because the state hospitals were closed and the community centers failed, the streets essentially became the default unfunded asylums of the 21st century. We find these deeply vulnerable individuals sheltering in public parks, airport terminals, alleyways, and increasingly, they're funneled into the criminal justice system. And the brutal reality is that the trauma and physical degradation of homelessness exponentially worsens existing psychiatric problems, creating a vicious, inescapable cycle.
I did notice a glimmer of hope in the text, though. There was an evidence-based practice box focusing on a concept called trauma-informed design for housing. And then this seems like a highly logical approach to breaking that cycle.
It is a profoundly compassionate and clinically sound architectural approach. We know that a massive percentage of unhoused individuals carry severe compounded trauma. Therefore, if you are going to build supportive housing for this population, you cannot just build a generic institutional shelter. You must embrace trauma-informed principles, ensuring absolute physical safety, providing the resident with choices, and fostering collaboration.
The physical features described in this model really struck me. They advocate for strict noise reduction, abundant natural light, and direct access to outdoor green spaces. And when you think about the underlying psychology, it makes perfect sense. If you have a patient whose nervous system is highly reactive to sensory input due to severe PTSD, you cannot put them in a loud, echoing, chaotic shelter environment and expect them to suddenly stabilize. You have to design the physical environment to soothe the nervous system.
Exactly. The environment itself must become therapeutic. But here's the friction point. Designing, building, and staffing this kind of tailored, highly supportive community housing is incredibly expensive. And that brings us crashing into the financial reality of the 21st century mental health system, cost containment, and the era of managed care.
Right, because in the 1970s and 1980s, overall healthcare costs in the United States were spiraling completely out of control. So the insurance industry and the government introduced managed care, which was specifically designed to control the delicate balance between the quality of care provided and the cost of that care.
The fundamental shift was that medical care became based on an assessed need rather than a patient's or doctor's request. And crucially, that need was increasingly assessed and dictated by the managed care organization or the insurance company actually paying the bill.
Moving into the 1990s, we saw the rise of utilization review firms. These entities required healthcare providers to formally seek approval before delivering care to a psychiatric patient. And this era also introduced a prominent role: case management.
In pure clinical theory, assigning a dedicated case manager to coordinate a patient's complex web of medical, psychiatric, and social needs sounds fantastic. It should decrease the fragmentation of care and eliminate overlapping services.
But in the harsh reality of the financial system,
In reality, the text explicitly states that case management is frequently utilized as a tool for cost containment. Expenditures are often systematically reduced by withholding specific services that the reviewer deems unnecessary, or by substituting highly specialized care with significantly less expensive, often less effective treatments.
which raises a massive philosophical question. Are the goals of cost containment and managed care fundamentally at odds with the biological reality of treating mental health? Psychiatric care is inherently costly because these disorders are deeply ingrained, chronic, and require long-term intervention. You can't fix schizophrenia with a 30-day pill pack.
And as the foundational text points out, psychiatry operates with far fewer objective, quantifiable measures than physical medicine. If a patient comes into the ER and reports intense suicidal ideation, the clinician has to rely primarily on that subjective report. There's no rapid blood test for suicide risk. There is no MRI that proves a patient is experiencing a manic episode. Because the data is subjective, it is much easier for an insurance reviewer to deny coverage, claiming the need isn't objectively proven.
This historical bias against mental health resulted in psychiatric care being entirely separated from physical health in insurance policies. For decades, insurers placed strict, arbitrary dollar limits on mental health coverage, or they enforced hard caps on the number of psychiatric hospital days a patient was allowed per year, regardless of clinical need. And when private insurance runs out, the patient is dumped onto the state's public system, and state governments are perpetually facing economic deficits.
This structural inequality is why the concept of parity became the major legislative battleground. Mental health parity simply means demanding legal equality in insurance coverage, treating mental illnesses exactly the same as physical illnesses in terms of deductibles, copays, and treatment limits.
And in 1996, Congress seemingly took a massive step forward by passing the Mental Health Parity Act. It officially eliminated the arbitrary annual and lifetime dollar caps for mental health care for companies that had more than 50 employees. On paper, that sounds like a massive victory.
It was a step forward, but the 1996 Act was riddled with massive crippling loopholes. For example, the law explicitly did not require coverage for substance misuse disorders, completely ignoring the reality of dual diagnoses we discussed earlier.
And even more insidiously, while they couldn't cap the total dollar amount, companies were still legally allowed to strictly limit the number of days a patient could stay in the hospital or cap the total number of outpatient clinic visits allowed per year.
So it was absolutely not true parity. Furthermore, the law had a fundamental flaw. If an employer or insurer simply chose not to offer any mental health coverage whatsoever, they didn't have to comply with the parity rules at all. It created a fragmented patchwork system that continually leaves millions of deeply ill people without access to adequate long-term care.
And as the text points out, the great financial betrayal of deinstitutionalization remains unresolved. The billions of dollars that state governments saved when they shuttered the massive state asylums was never actually transferred into the budgets for community mental health programs. Community mental health has never, in its entire history, possessed the financial base required to fulfill its mandate.
Which is incredibly frustrating because the work required at the community level is profoundly labor-intensive. The text notes that community programs are tasked with teaching clients the granular daily skills necessary for independent living. You cannot teach a client who is actively managing auditory hallucinations how to budget their SSI check or shop for groceries in a large passive classroom setting. It often requires intense one-to-one staff-to-client ratios. It requires patience, repetition, and deep clinical expertise.
Yet, despite all of these massive systemic flaws, the chronic underfunding, the revolving door, the managed care restrictions, the clinical consensus remains that community-based care is still vastly preferable to returning to the era of massive isolated institutions. In the community, clients maintain their personal freedom, they maintain vital contact with their families, and they don't permanently lose their daily living skills the way they inevitably would if locked away in a ward for decades.
It is the better philosophical model. It is just a model starving for resources.
So, if the system is under this much immense, crushing pressure, if we have an exploding patient population, restricted insurance, insufficient beds, and profound underfunding, who is actually standing on the front lines holding this fragile infrastructure together?
The psychiatric nurse, they're the linchpin of the entire system.
And this is where we really want to focus the rest of our time, moving into the direct clinical reality. The history of the psychiatric nursing role is actually surprisingly recent compared to the rest of the medical profession.
It is. The title of the very first American psychiatric nurse is credited to a woman named Linda Richards. She graduated from nursing school in 1873, and her core advocacy was built on a simple yet utterly revolutionary belief for the time. She argued that the mentally sick should be, at the absolute minimum, as well cared for as the physically sick.
In 1882, at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts, they finally began formally training nurses specifically to work with mental illness. But it's important to understand that back then, the nursing role was almost entirely custodial. They were responsible for basic nutrition, physical hygiene, and monitoring ward activity. They weren't engaged in complex psychotherapy.
The scope of practice didn't truly expand until the 1930s, with the arrival of aggressive somatic therapies.
Right. This is when doctors began using extreme physical interventions like insulin shock therapy, where they would intentionally induce a daily coma in schizophrenic patients, as well as psychosurgery like lobotomies and early electroconvulsive therapy. Suddenly, psychiatric nurses needed intense medical surgical skills to manage the severe physical side effects and recovery processes of these extreme treatments.
It wasn't until 1920 that Harriet Bailey finally published the very first dedicated psychiatric nursing textbook. And astoundingly, it took until 1950 for the National League for Nursing to mandate that all nursing schools must include a psychiatric clinical experience in their curriculum.
Which means before 1950, you could become a fully registered nurse without ever officially learning how to talk to a patient experiencing a mental health crisis. That is wild. But two massive, towering figures eventually emerged to shape the modern, highly specialized practice of psychiatric nursing: Hildegard Peplau and June Mello.
Hildegard Peplau's work, published in 1952, shifted the entire paradigm. She deeply explored and formalized the therapeutic nurse-client relationship. Her enduring legacy is defining the interpersonal dimension of nursing, proving that the relationship itself, how the nurse interacts with the patient's anxiety, is a primary vehicle for healing.
And then in 1968, June Mello expanded on this by focusing intently on the client's psychosocial needs and inherent strengths. She believed that the psychiatric nurse was uniquely positioned to work with severely ill patients, not in the abstract, but in the immediate context of their daily activities. She focused the nursing intervention entirely on the here and now.
Today, the profession is highly structured. Practice is rigidly guided by standards established by the American Nurses Association, the ANA, and the American Psychiatric Nurses Association.
And they clearly differentiate the scope of practice. There is the basic level of function for registered nurses, which includes managing milieu therapy, which, for those who don't know, means intentionally utilizing and managing every aspect of the patient's physical and social environment as a therapeutic tool. It includes maintaining safety, health teaching, and providing basic counseling.
Then there is the advanced practice level, which requires a master's degree or higher. These practitioners are legally authorized to conduct deep psychotherapy and possess prescriptive authority to manage psychotropic medications.
But let's step away from the theory and get down to the absolute ground level. The foundational text includes a vital section on student concerns, and this is the absolute high-yield critical thinking material for anyone stepping onto a psychiatric unit for the first time. Because let's be honest, For a nursing student who has spent 2 years learning how to expertly take a blood pressure, hang an IV bag, and monitor a heart rate, walking onto a psych unit with no physical tasks to hide behind can be absolutely terrifying.
It is intensely intimidating. And the text identifies that the primary overwhelming fear for almost every new student is, what if I say the wrong thing?
I totally understand that anxiety. You are standing in front of a human being who is experiencing a profound emotional or psychotic crisis. You feel like one wrong word could trigger an escalation or deepen their trauma.
But the text offers incredibly grounding, practical advice to dismantle that fear. It reassures the student that there is no magical, perfect phrase that will instantly solve a patient's complex psychological problem. And conversely, there is almost no single clumsy statement that will permanently worsen the patient's condition.
The intervention isn't about having a perfectly scripted line. The actual intervention is the act of listening carefully. It is demonstrating genuine, unhurried interest and conveying basic human care.
Exactly. And the text encourages authenticity. If a student says something awkward or phrasing comes out wrong, they shouldn't panic or withdraw. Just own it. Simply say to the patient, that didn't come out right. What I really meant to ask was, it models healthy, imperfect human communication.
Another massive concern students have is, what will I actually be doing? Because on a medical surgical floor, you are constantly executing physical tasks. On a psych unit, it often feels like you are just talking.
This is a major misconception that needs to be broken. In psychiatric nursing, just talking is an incredibly complex, deliberate, and highly skilled therapeutic intervention. It requires immense patience to slowly build rapport, to accurately read microexpressions, to establish trust with someone who is inherently paranoid, and to gently guide a conversation toward therapeutic goals without interrogating them.
Which naturally leads to the next fear. What if a client asks the student deeply personal questions, or the student feels like they are invasively prying into the patient's trauma?
The key clinical skill here is timing and boundary management. You do not sit down on day one and ask a patient to detail their deepest trauma. You start with the weather, the food, the immediate milieu. You build a foundation of basic rapport. And when the time comes to ask the deeply personal questions within the context of a formal assessment or therapeutic goal, the nurse must understand that it is not prying. Gathering sensitive information is a critical medical necessity to provide safe care.
Let's talk about the biggest, most primal concern, physical safety. Is my physical safety in jeopardy? Pop culture and the media paint this horrific, stigmatizing picture that every single person locked on a psychiatric ward is violently unpredictable.
Which is statistically and fundamentally false. The data consistently shows that psychiatric clients are far, far more likely to hurt themselves than they are to hurt anyone else. However, because psychiatric environments deal with unpredictable crises, students are taught very specific, high-yield safety priorities.
Like the physical positioning rules. The text explicitly tells nurses to sit in an open area, never a closed, isolated room, and to give the client plenty of physical space. I want to dig into the why behind that.
It comes down to understanding the neurobiology of trauma and psychosis. If a patient's nervous system is stuck in a profound state of fight or flight, their brain is constantly scanning for threats. If you corner them in a small, closed room, or if you sit too close and invade their physical boundary, their traumatized brain perceives you as a literal predator. The lack of an exit route triggers panic, which can instantly escalate into defensive aggression. Giving them physical space and keeping an open door physically lowers the temperature of their nervous system.
That makes total sense. The text also gives a hard rule about physical altercations. Students should never, under any circumstances, jump in to physically restrain a patient.
Absolutely. Physical restraint is an extreme, highly dangerous, last resort intervention. If a patient escalates to violence, the student's job is to step back and rely on the seasoned staff who are highly trained in verbal de-escalation protocols and, only if strictly necessary, coordinated, safe physical holds. Jumping in without training usually results in severe injury to both the nurse and the patient.
Then there is the incredibly uncomfortable issue of boundaries. What if a client asks me for a date or starts acting sexually inappropriately?
This happens, and the response must be immediate, firm, and professionally calibrated. The student, often with the support of their clinical instructor, must directly clarify the strict boundaries of the professional relationship. They must state clearly, without shaming the patient, that the relationship is strictly therapeutic.
Setting that boundary protects both the nurse's comfort and the client's psychological safety, preventing any dangerous blurring of roles. But of everything in this clinical section, the most profound concept, the one that really defines what it means to be an elite psychiatric practitioner, is the demand for absolute self-awareness.
Self-awareness is not a corporate buzzword in this field. It is the most critical safety and therapeutic tool in the psychiatric nurse's arsenal. The text defines it as the rigorous, ongoing process by which the nurse gains deep recognition of their own internal feelings, their ingrained beliefs, and their unconscious attitudes.
The example the text uses to illustrate this is striking, and it perfectly highlights the cognitive dissonance required in this job. It presents a scenario where a nurse who holds a deep, personal, moral belief that abortion is fundamentally wrong is assigned to care for a client who is suffering severe depression following a recent abortion.
That is the ultimate test of clinical professionalism. The nurse is not required to change their personal moral beliefs. They are not required to personally condone the patient's actions. But they are absolutely required to possess the self-awareness to recognize their internal bias, compartmentalize it, and prevent that personal judgment from leaking into their therapeutic communication or hindering the patient's care.
If the nurse unconsciously radiates disapproval, they will destroy any chance of building the trust needed to treat the depression.
Precisely. If a nurse does not intimately know their own psychological triggers, their own cultural biases, or their own unhealed traumas, they are essentially flying blind. You cannot effectively de-escalate a patient's crisis if the patient's behavior is unconsciously triggering your own defensive anxiety. You must be deeply aware of your own internal landscape before you have any hope of safely navigating someone else's.
The text suggests highly practical ways to build this muscle. Keeping a detailed reflective journal, actively seeking out supervision and talking with trusted clinical mentors, and deliberately, constantly challenging yourself to seek alternative points of view and put yourself in the client's shoes.
It is exhausting, incredibly demanding emotional labor. In orthopedic nursing, your primary tools might be a stethoscope and a splint. But in psychiatric nursing, your primary medical instrument is your own mind, your own regulated nervous system, and your own boundless empathy.
Okay, we have covered an immense, sprawling amount of ground today. We journeyed all the way back to ancient times, where behavioral illness was terrifyingly misunderstood as the wrath of the gods. We walked through the horrific era of dungeons and bedlam into the well-intentioned but ultimately doomed asylum movement championed by reformers like Dorothea Dix.
We deeply examined the double-edged sword of the 1950s, how the miraculous psychopharmacology revolution of thorazine and lithium made deinstitutionalization conceptually possible, but how catastrophic financial loopholes and political failures abandoned hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people to the streets and the criminal justice system.
We analyzed the crushing realities of the modern crisis, the futility of the 3 to 5 day revolving door, the trauma of emergency department boarding, the vital need for trauma-informed housing, and the maddening, loophole-ridden complexities of managed care and the Parity Act.
And we grounded all of this systemic history in the vital, immediate, relationship-driven work of the psychiatric nurse, emphasizing that beyond any medication, the absolute necessity of self-awareness and intentional therapeutic communication is what actually saves lives.
For you listening, whether you are a nursing student cramming for an exam and trying to understand the why behind the safety rules, or you are just an engaged citizen trying to comprehend why the mental health system in your community looks the way it does, understanding this complex history and these systemic flaws is essential. It is the only way we can begin to effectively advocate for better, more compassionate, and fully funded care.
We absolutely must understand the failures of the past if we're ever going to stop the revolving door of the present.
But before we go, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. Earlier, we touched on a fascinating, entirely unanswered question from the text regarding student concerns and patient histories. The text openly admits that despite all of our DSM criteria and neurobiological research, we still do not fully understand the mystery of human trauma. We don't know why two human beings can experience the exact same severe, catastrophic trauma, yet one person manages to cope successfully and adapt, while the other is completely emotionally devastated.
It remains one of the greatest, most profound mysteries in all of psychiatry, the hidden biology of human resilience.
So I want you to think about this. As genetic mapping and neuroimaging become infinitely more advanced, if science eventually unlocks that specific biological secret to human resilience, Wait, Jay. I mean, if we find the exact mechanism that makes one brain shatter and another brain endure, how will that completely redefine our entire understanding of what mental illness actually is? In 100 years, will doctors look back at our highly detailed DSM-5 TR with the exact same bemused pity that we currently feel when we look back at Aristotle's theory of the four humors?
It is a profoundly humbling question to ponder. It reminds us that our current science is just a stepping stone.
Something for you to mull over until next time. Thank you for joining us in the Muddy Waters. We'll see you on the next deep dive.